My name is Nora Bennett, and I have spent nearly 2 decades building my life from the ground up. Before I ever met my husband Daniel, I had already created something real. A property consulting business I started from a single rented desk in a shared office. A portfolio of smart investments I had grown carefully over 15 years. A reputation in my industry that I had earned through long hours, difficult clients, and decisions that kept me up at night until I got them right. I wasn't flashy about any of it. I never felt the need to be. The work spoke for itself, and the results showed up in my bank account, not in conversations at dinner parties. But none of that history mattered to Daniel's parents. To them, I was simply the woman who had married their son for his money. They never asked who I really was. For a long time, I let them believe their own story. Until the day they lost their house and found out who had bought it. The moment that started everything happened at Miriam's birthday dinner. Miriam was Daniel's mother, a tall, well-dressed woman who carried herself like someone who had never once been wrong about anything. The dinner was held at their home, a large property in a quiet neighborhood that the family referenced constantly, the way people do when a house is less a home and more a statement about who they believe they are. There were 12 of us around the table. Daniel's father, who everyone called Hank, sat at the head. His sister and her husband. A few cousins. And me seated beside Daniel, 3 years into our marriage and still never quite sure where I fit inside that room. Miriam raised her glass midway through the main course. She smiled at the table, and then she looked directly at me. "Let's all thank Nora," she said pleasantly, "for marrying Daniel. Someone had to enjoy the money he worked so hard for." The table responded with laughter, the uncomfortable kind, where people laugh because they don't know what else to do. Miriam added, still smiling, "We all know why she's here." I kept my face completely still. I reached for my glass and took a slow sip. Beside me, Daniel looked at the tablecloth. That silence, his silence, hurt more than anything Miriam had said out loud. Later that night, after the plates were cleared and the cousins had moved to the living room, Miriam found me alone in the kitchen. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She spoke the way people speak when they are completely confident that no one will challenge them. She told me that women like me married up, and that families like theirs had learned to recognize it. She said I had walked into a life that other people had spent decades building. Then she added the line I never forgot. "Just remember," she said, turning toward the door, "this family owned everything before you showed up." She left the kitchen without waiting for a response. I stood at the counter for a long moment, staring at the wall. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't about to cry. I was doing something else, something quieter and more dangerous than either of those things. I was paying very close attention. When we got home that night, Daniel apologized. He sat on the edge of the bed and said he was sorry about his mother's comments, that she didn't always think before she spoke, that she meant well underneath it all. The apology sounded like something he had rehearsed many times before, not necessarily for me, but for the version of this conversation he had always known was eventually coming. I asked him why he hadn't said anything at the table. He looked at the floor and said, "You know how my parents are. It's not worth making it bigger than it is." I looked at him for a long time after that. I didn't argue. I didn't push. I simply sat with what he had just told me, because what he had just told me was very clear. He was not going to stand between me and his family. And in that moment, quietly and without drama, I understood that in this marriage, I was standing alone. The comments didn't stop after that night. They became a fixture of every family gathering, the way bad weather becomes something you simply plan around. At Easter, Miriam remarked that it must be nice to have a husband who provided so well. At a family barbecue in the summer, Hank made a comment about Daniel carrying the household. At a nephew's birthday party, a cousin I barely knew asked me, within earshot of several people, whether I had worked before the marriage. Each comment was delivered lightly, with a smile, in the tone people use when they want to say something unkind but also want to claim later that it was just a joke. What none of them knew, what I had never once brought up in 3 years of dinners and holidays and polite conversation, was that I had been running my own business since I was 25 years old. I had never felt the need to announce it. But I was starting to feel the weight of that silence differently now. The truth of my life before Daniel was not complicated. It was just quiet. I had started my property consulting firm 15 years before we married, working with a single client out of a rented desk in a shared office on the edge of the city. I had spent the first 2 years barely covering my costs, taking every job I could find, learning the market by living inside it every single day. By year 5, I had a small team and a reputation for finding undervalued properties that other consultants overlooked. By year 10, I had a client list that included developers, private investors, and 2 regional funds. I also had a personal investment portfolio I had built alongside the business, properties I had bought, renovated, and held or sold at the right moments, always reinvesting the returns. I had savings. I had assets. I had a financial life that was entirely my own. I simply had no interest in using it to impress people who had already decided what they thought of me. Thanksgiving that year was worse than the birthday dinner. Miriam waited until the table was full and the food was being passed before she made her comment. She said, looking at me with that particular smile of hers, "Claire is so lucky. She found a man who keeps her comfortable." Before I could process that, Hank looked up from his plate and said, "Let's just hope she doesn't take half if things ever go south." The table went quiet for a beat, the kind of quiet that happens when something crosses a line that even the people laughing usually recognize. I looked at Daniel. He picked up his fork. He said nothing. I cut a piece of turkey and chewed it slowly and smiled at whoever was nearest to me and changed absolutely nothing about my expression. But on the drive home that night, sitting in the dark of the passenger seat while Daniel navigated the highway, I asked him a direct question. I asked him if he actually believed I had married him for his money. He didn't answer immediately. The pause was only 2 seconds long. But 2 seconds of silence, when a question like that is sitting in the air between you, is an answer of its own. I turned to look at the window and watched the city lights pass. That was the night I began planning my future differently. I didn't leave immediately. Leaving in a rush, in the heat of hurt feelings, was not how I operated. I had never made important decisions that way, and I wasn't about to start. Instead, I did what I had always done when something in my life needed to change. I focused forward. I went back to my business with renewed attention. I took on bigger clients. I started looking at commercial property opportunities one had been cautiously circling for 2 years. I began expanding my investment portfolio into 2 new neighborhoods that my research told me were quietly building toward significant value. I worked early mornings and late evenings. I attended industry events I had been skipping. I rebuilt momentum I hadn't realized I had let slow down during the years I had spent trying to fit into someone else's family. Daniel noticed none of this. He came home, ate dinner, watched television, and went to bed. He was not a bad man. He was simply a man who had never once looked at me closely enough to see what was actually there. The information about Miriam and Hank's financial situation came to me by accident. I had driven to their house one Sunday afternoon with Daniel for a routine family visit. We arrived a few minutes early and let ourselves in through the side door, the way the family always did. Before we reached the kitchen, we could hear voices, Miriam and Hank, speaking in low, tight tones that carried the specific tension of a conversation that had been going around in circles for a while. I heard the word refinancing. I heard Hank say something about the bank's deadline. I heard Miriam say they had no more options. Daniel and I backed quietly to the hallway and made enough noise coming in the second time that the conversation stopped before we reached the kitchen. Nothing was mentioned over coffee. Everything was normal and pleasant and completely performative in the way that families are when something is being held just below the surface. On the drive home, I said nothing. But I had heard enough. Over the following weeks, pieces of the truth came through Daniel, slowly and reluctantly, the way information always travels through families where pride is more important than honesty. Hank had spent the better part of 6 years investing in a series of business ventures that had never returned what he put into them. Each failure had been covered by borrowing against the house, the same house Miriam referenced constantly, the property that was the centerpiece of the family's identity and the foundation of their sense of superiority. The loans had accumulated quietly. The interest had grown. The business ventures had not recovered. The house, it turned out, was not a symbol of security. It was the last thing standing between them and a financial collapse that had been building for years. I sat with this information carefully. I didn't react emotionally. I didn't feel satisfaction or contempt. I simply filed it away and thought about what it meant. Because in my industry, information like that is never just a private family matter. It is also an opportunity. Christmas arrived with the usual decorations and the usual performance. Miriam had decorated the house beautifully. The tree was enormous. The table was set with the good china. Every surface looked like it had been arranged specifically, so that nothing about the evening would suggest that anything was wrong. I sat at the table and watched her move through the room, pouring wine, directing seating, accepting compliments about the food, and I thought about how much energy it must take to maintain an image when the walls behind it are cracking. Then she made her comment. She was addressing the whole table when she said it, loudly enough to make sure everyone heard, that she hoped I wasn't already eyeing the inheritance now that I'd been in the family a few years. People laughed. Hank smiled. Daniel studied his wine glass. I looked at Miriam across the table and smiled back at her. Something inside me had gone very calm, quieter and harder than before. I had made no decisions yet, but I had stopped pretending, at least to myself, that things between us were ever going to be any different. The foreclosure notice came in early spring. I found out through Daniel, who called me from outside his office in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon, his voice lower than usual and carrying that particular strain people have when they're trying to describe something shameful without using any of the accurate words for it. He said the bank had started proceedings against his parents' house. He said it had happened fast at the end, faster than any of them expected. He said Miriam was devastated and Hank was barely speaking. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, I asked him if there was anything he needed from me right now. He said he didn't know yet. I told him to take his time and let me know. After we hung up, I sat at my desk for a few minutes, looking at nothing in particular. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up the county property records database. The family reacted to the foreclosure the way families always react when something that was hidden too long finally becomes impossible to hide, with panic first, then blame, then the desperate scramble to find someone who could fix it. Daniel called me 2 days later and asked, carefully, whether I knew anyone through my real estate contacts who might be able to help his parents negotiate with the bank or find some kind of alternative arrangement. I told him I might know a few people. I said I would look into it. What I didn't tell him was that I had already been looking into it for 48 hours. I had pulled the property records. I had checked the outstanding loan amounts against the current market value. I had researched the specific bank's foreclosure auction process, the timeline, the bidding rules, and the estimated sale price based on 3 comparable properties in the same neighborhood that had sold in the past year. The house was going to sell far below its actual value. And I was starting to understand, slowly and clearly, exactly what I was going to do. The auction notice was published the second week of April. The property would go to public auction at the county courthouse at 10 in the morning on a Thursday, 31 days from the date of the notice. Any registered bidder could participate. The opening price had been set at the outstanding loan balance, which was significantly lower than what the property was actually worth on the current market. Miriam apparently called 3 of her siblings the day the notice was published. Daniel told me she had spent most of that day crying and the rest of it blaming Hank, the banks, the economy, and at least twice, according to Daniel's telling, outsiders who drain families dry. He said it without looking at me. I don't think he connected what he was repeating to the person he was saying it to. Or perhaps he did and simply hoped I wouldn't. I didn't respond to that part. I asked him to pass the details of the auction to me in writing, so I could forward them to the contacts I had mentioned. He sent them that evening. I spent the following week doing what I had done dozens of times over my career, studying a property with the discipline of someone who understands exactly what they are looking at. I drove past the house 3 times at different hours of the day. I walked the street. I looked at the lot size, the structure, the condition of the exterior. I pulled permits and renovation records. I researched every sale in that neighborhood going back 10 years and mapped the trajectory of values against the broader market movement. The house was well built, well located, and sitting in a neighborhood that had quietly appreciated by 31% in the past 5 years alone. At the auction's estimated opening price, it was one of the most straightforward investment opportunities one had seen in years. I called my financial advisor. I reviewed my available capital. I had a conversation with my business attorney about the acquisition structure and what made the most sense given my current portfolio. By the end of the week, everything was in order. I registered to attend the auction. The decision had not come from anger. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to frame what I did as revenge, as the satisfying conclusion to years of insults and small humiliations and dinner table performances at my expense. And I would be lying if I said that none of that history was present in my thinking. But revenge is reactive. Revenge is something you do because someone hurt you and you want them to feel it back. What I was doing was different. I was a property consultant with 15 years of experience, looking at a genuinely undervalued asset going to auction at a price well below market. I had the capital. I had the knowledge. I had registered legally along with every other investor who would be in that room. The only unusual element was the personal history. But personal history is not a reason to walk away from sound business. I went over my decision one final time the night before the auction, sitting alone at my kitchen table. Then I closed my files and went to bed. The courthouse auction room was smaller than most people imagine. It smelled like old carpet and recycled air and held about 40 people on the morning of Miriam and Hank's foreclosure. Investors in suits. A few developers I recognized from industry events. A couple of individuals who had the look of first-time buyers hoping to find a bargain. And near the back of the room, seated side by side in the last row of chairs, Miriam and Hank. I had arrived early and chosen a seat near the middle, closer to the aisle. I was wearing a plain gray blazer and had my bidder registration card in my jacket pocket. Miriam hadn't seen me yet. She was staring straight ahead, her handbag held tightly in her lap, her jaw set in that particular way it got when she was holding herself together through willpower alone. Hank sat beside her with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the floor. I looked at them for a moment. Then I turned back toward the front of the room and waited for the proceedings to begin. The auctioneer moved efficiently through the formalities. The property was described. The opening bid was announced. The room shifted into the focused, low-energy rhythm of professional bidding. Hands raised, prices climbing in measured increments, the auctioneer's voice moving the process forward at a steady pace. I kept my hand down through the early rounds. I watched the room. I tracked the other serious bidders, identified the two who were pushing hardest, and waited while the price climbed past the opening figure, and then slowed as the number reached the point where casual interest fell away. The room thinned out. The price stalled. It was sitting at a number that I had calculated was still $40,000 below conservative market value. I raised my hand. The auctioneer acknowledged me. The remaining bidder across the room countered. I raised again. He paused, the pause of someone recalculating, and did not come back. The gavel came down. I had bought the house. The paperwork was completed at a table near the front of the room. I signed where the clerk indicated, provided my registration documentation, and accepted the receipt that confirmed the transaction. It was orderly and quick and entirely unremarkable in the way that legal processes usually are, regardless of what they mean to the people involved. When I straightened up from the table and turned to gather my things, I noticed that Miriam had stood up from the back row and was making her way toward the exit. She passed through the middle of the room, and her eyes swept across the space in the distracted way of someone moving through a crowd without really seeing it. And then her gaze landed on me. She stopped. She looked at the paperwork in my hand. She looked at the clerk. She looked back at me. Her face did not collapse into any single expression. It moved through several at once. Confusion first, then a rapid reassessment, then something I had never once seen on her face in 3 years of knowing her. Something that looked very much like fear. She found me outside on the courthouse steps. She moved quickly once the initial shock had passed, and by the time I reached the bottom of the steps she was right behind me, her voice sharp and low and stripped of the pleasant social tone she usually maintained in public. She asked me what I was doing there. I turned to face her calmly. I told her I had attended the auction. She stared at me. Her chin was lifted. Her voice had that tight, controlled quality it got when she was genuinely unsettled but unwilling to let it show completely. She said she didn't understand. I told her I was the winning bidder on the property. She said that again. She said she didn't understand, and this time it came out differently. Slower. More like something she was saying to herself than to me. Behind her, Hank had appeared at the top of the steps. He looked at his wife, then at me, then at the receipt in my hand. Nobody spoke for a moment. The street moved quietly around us. I hadn't planned a speech. I had not rehearsed a single sentence of what came next. I simply looked at Miriam and told her the truth, the way I should have told her years earlier, not to prove anything, but because the time for silence had run out. I told her about my business. Not the version condensed for polite company, but the real version, when I started it, how I built it, the clients I had worked with, the properties I had bought and sold over 15 years of careful, consistent work. I told her about my investment portfolio and what it was currently worth. I told her that every car, every holiday, every item in my own home had been purchased with money I had earned myself, long before Daniel and I had ever met. I told her that I had never once needed her son's money. I had simply loved him. Miriam stood on the courthouse steps and listened to all of it. She didn't interrupt. She didn't reach for one of her usual rejoinders. By the time I finished, the expression on her face was one I had never seen there before. She expected me to evict them. I could see it in how she was holding herself, braced, like someone waiting for the final blow to land. Hank had come down the steps and was standing beside her, and he had the same look. The look of people who know they have run out of options and are waiting to find out exactly how bad the last one is going to be. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I told them they could stay in the house. Not permanently. Not without conditions. I told them I would give them a reasonable period to make other arrangements, enough time to sort through their situation properly, to find something suitable, to leave on their own terms rather than being put out in a hurry. I was not doing it for them. I was doing it because it was the right thing to do, and I had always known the difference between those two things, even when the people I was extending that courtesy to had not extended it to me. Miriam opened her mouth. Then she closed it. Hank looked at the ground. There was a conversation on the steps that afternoon that lasted only a few more minutes, but I have thought about it many times since. Miriam didn't apologize. Not that day. That would come later, and even then it would be small and difficult for her and clearly cost her something she wasn't accustomed to paying. But on those steps, in the immediate aftermath of everything, she said very little. What she did do was look at me differently. Not with warmth. Not yet. But with something that might eventually become the foundation of it, a kind of reluctant recalibration. The slow adjustment of someone whose understanding of a person has just been forcibly and completely revised. She had spent 3 years building a story about who I was. I had just spent 10 minutes dismantling it with facts she could not argue with. I watched that story fall apart in her expression, piece by piece, and I felt no triumph in it. Only a quiet, steady tiredness at how much energy had been spent on something so unnecessary. Daniel and I had been quietly, carefully, and mutually separating for months before the auction. There was no dramatic ending. No single terrible fight. Just the slow, honest recognition between two people that the foundation had not held, that what we had built together had been built with different understandings of what marriage required, and that those understandings were too far apart to bridge. He had not defended me. Not once. Not at the birthday dinner, not at Thanksgiving, not on any of the dozens of smaller occasions in between. He had chosen, every single time, to let his family's comfort matter more than my dignity. I didn't hate him for it. I had simply arrived at the clear-eyed understanding that I could not build a life with someone who saw me that way. The separation was finalized 3 months before the auction. He found out about the house purchase the same day everyone else did. He called me that evening. The conversation was short. He said he didn't know what to say. I told him that was all right. I said I hoped he was well. And I meant it. I still own the house. Miriam moved out 8 months after the auction, into a small apartment on the other side of town. She took what mattered to her and left the rest behind, the way people do when they're starting a smaller version of the life they used to have. The last time we spoke, she called me on a Tuesday afternoon out of nowhere. We talked for about 15 minutes. At the end of the call, before she hung up, she said something quietly and without any of the rehearsed smoothness she usually brought to difficult moments. She said, "I was wrong about you, Nora." That was all. It was enough. I did not buy that house to punish anyone. I bought it because it was a sound investment in a neighborhood I understood, at a price that made clear financial sense. I bought it the same way I had bought every other property in my portfolio, with careful research, available capital, and a calm decision made without emotion clouding the numbers. The fact that it also answered 15 years of quiet doubt in the minds of people who never once thought to ask who I really was. That part was simply the truth doing what the truth always eventually does. It found its way to the surface. On its own schedule. Without any help from me at all.